All right, we're recording. Hi, everyone, and thanks again for tuning in to another one of my interviews. And for those of you who keep inundating me with emails about the conversion of a lot of these into an official podcast that's going to go up on Spotify and Apple and those sorts of things, it's in the works. So be patient. Come on, hang on. It takes a while to do these things. I'm waiting on some artwork, and then we'll go from there. But anyway, my guest today, I'm very excited. It's a return guest. I think I've had him on twice before. It's Robert Mixa. He works for Word on Fire, Bishop Barron's outfit, and he is the Word on Fire Fellow for Education. And we've talked about education before, and I want to talk a little bit about that today as well. But before we get into that, and we want to talk a little bit about the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche that Robert has been doing some research on. We're going to discuss the theology of David L. Schindler, who we both admire greatly. And of course, David Schindler passed away a few weeks ago now. I can't remember, maybe about a month ago now, even. And it was a very beautiful funeral down in Maryland. St. Jerome's Parish, which my wife and I attended, and that was great. I'm sorry you weren't there, Robert, because it was a who's
Yeah.
who of Communio types, Communio theologians, and others who had known David Schindler for many decades. Father Fessio gave a very moving homily, extremely moving. There wasn't a dry eye in the house when
Yeah.
he finished, including Father Fessio, and it was just a great tribute. And what it really, one of the things I was most proud of, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, was the fact that as I was scanning the crowd of people there, I looked out and I counted more than I could count because they kept moving around, but more than I could count of former students of mine from DeSales University who we, Dr. Hauser, Rodney Hauser, and I had sent off to the Institute, John Paul II Institute in Washington, and who were now PhDs in their own right and had studied under Schindler and were, in a sense, leavening the academic world out there. And so it was a proud moment for me, as well as a sad moment, to see that all of the work that I had done over the decades in cultivating a relationship between the theology department at DeSales and the Institute in Washington had been extremely fruitful. And to me, this is the great legacy of David Schindler, is that his theology, his thought was infectious, and he had an absolute passion for passing his theological vision, metaphysical vision, on to students, and the impact he had on so many young lives is just incalculable. And so I just want to get that out there. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you. Um, Tell us a little bit about your relationship with David Schindler and what Dr. Schindler meant to you and why.
Yeah. 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 Sadly, my wife and I we couldn't make the funeral, but luckily I had Connor Dugan there. So Connor was I think secretly recording everything, all the DC Schindler's eulogy for his father. I have a recording of that. I don't know if DC knows about that, but it was
Oh,
quite
wow.
good.
Oh, stop right there a
Yeah.
second, because it was one of the big shames of the funeral that I really was sad about was that many of the guests had left the reception by the time that young Dave Schindler, his son David C. Schindler, gave
Mm.
an incredibly moving eulogy for his father. And it came at the very end of the reception, and it would have been great if it had come earlier. I think that it didn't come earlier because David Schindler, young Dave, was not emotionally up to it, and because you can tell when he gave the talk that it was an enormously straining and emotional moment for him, but it
Yeah.
was an unbelievably moving tribute to his father.
Yeah.
And one of the thing that stuck out in my mind, and I keep talking, I'm going to get back to you, but one of the things that stuck out in my mind, I kept repeating in my brain over and over as I listened to young Dave, is that the torch has been passed. That another one of David L. Schindler's great legacies is his son, David C. Schindler, who is just quite frankly a genius in his own right, and who needs
Yeah.
to be paid more attention to. But anyway, back. Oh, by the way, Connor Dugan, I met him for
And,
the first time in
oh, really?
person at the funeral. He's delightfully insane, as is his wife.
Yes.
I loved the encounter. So
Yeah.
Connor, if you're listening, that was great meeting you. But anyway, without any further interruptions, back to you, Robert, with
Yeah. Well, maybe just a little story. The torch will maybe be passed on to one of DC's sons, because I remember there was a story DC shared of his son having a nightmare, and he was screaming, and they got him, picked him, tried to calm him down, and he he started screaming and pointing to one of the busts they had in the room, and it was a bust of Immanuel Kant. And so they knew that the Kantian nightmare was possibly a good sign. So maybe, I know they're studying German from a young age, so maybe they have that like mystic metaphysical soul in the Schindler blood. So yeah, but I came to know Dr. Schindler because when I started working for Bishop Barron back in 2009, this was just when I graduated from St. Louis University. And this entire time when I was at St. Louis, I was studying philosophy, but I took a lot of theology classes. And I never heard one time the mention of Hans von Balthasar, not much about even Pope Benedict and Ratzinger. I didn't hear anything about Henri de Lubac, none of those Communio thinkers. I remember turning in one of my papers once, asking my teacher if this is a stupid question, but an undergrad question, if he knew of this guy named Hans Kuhn, because I was reading a little bit of this guy because his books were everywhere, and what he was saying in class seemed to resonate with what the teacher was saying. He's like, actually, that's my dissertation. That was my dissertation director. So that was kind of a little bit of at that time, perhaps I got too much of that type of approach. But it wasn't until I met Bishop Barron that I kind of got exposed to Communio. And he had in the office, he had all of these Communio journals along the wall. So given Chicago traffic, I would have to sometimes like spend a couple hours there by myself in the office just to wait. And I would read the Communio journal as I was waiting. I'm like, who is this Schindler guy? I'd read one article after another, and I felt like this guy is really he's such a keen observer in the American culture and what I'm experiencing. And I felt like there was such depth to his theology that it wasn't some kind of like superficial thing with an agenda, but got at like what I felt should be the essence of theology itself. And so I was thinking about going to the Institute, but I was a little concerned that because of the title Marriage and Family, it was, and it, like, forgive my ignorance here, but I thought it was kind of like a Christopher West kind of approach to theology of the body. But I'm like, that can't be, because all these Communio thinkers are there. And so anyways, I contacted one of my friends who was living in DC, who was friends with Connor Dugan, and Connor was friends with DL. And I said, how can I get in touch with this Schindler? I want to talk to him about the Institute. And it just so happened that DL Schindler was going to be at DePaul giving a talk to some event organized by Peter Casarella, and he needed a ride to the airport. So I was his ride to the airport. That turned in a couple hours.
Introduction to great men. I once had the experience of accompanying Walter Casper, Cardinal Casper, to the airport. It was my one great moment with a great cardinal of the church. Airport rides, they're important, dude.
Yeah. And didn't he say he was papal or something like that? Or
Hauser was with me. Cardinal Casper had given a talk on ecumenism in the Diocese of Allentown, and the Bishop of Allentown asked the two of us to ride in the limo to the New York airport to send Casper back to Europe. And it was right before John Paul died. Everybody knew that John Paul was, on his way out. And so we were talking about the upcoming conclave, and I said to him, well, maybe the next pope will be you, Cardinal Casper. And he goes, yes, perhaps. Yeah, that's me. And I don't say that in a negative way at all. I thought it was charming. He didn't say it in any arrogant way or anything. It's just like, yeah, anything's possible. But, with regard to Kung, and not to get off topic,
Yeah,
But
yeah.
for whatever reason, Hans Kung came up, and we asked him what he thought of Hans Kung. And Cardinal Casper said, well, the problem with Kung is that Hans Kung became Hans Kung. In other words, he sort of lived within the legend that was Hans Kung, and it sort of went to his head. Unfortunately, I think that was the implication of what he was saying. But anyway, back
Yeah.
to you.
No, no. Yeah, but you know what struck me with Schindler was just such a character. I got a actually
Yeah,
in that talk he gave, he ended with this quote from Nietzsche in Daybreak about pregnancy, and I'm like, I saw an appreciation for Nietzsche in Schindler, but he just seemed so humane. Nothing was off limits for him. He wasn't like a heresy hunter or somebody who wouldn't really
that's right.
embrace a thinker without really trying to understand what they saw. And I liked him immediately. And so as I we ended up giving a bunch of people rides to the various hotels, and I just would ask him all these questions. And for Schindler, no one had an adequate metaphysic. I remember at the time I was reading
Yeah.
Charles Taylor's Secular Age, and I had all these questions for him about that. And he told me to go read George Grant. In fact, the girl we drove back, she was writing on Charles Taylor, so I wasn't sure if she liked his not disdain, but not maybe lack of sufficient appreciation for Charles Taylor. But we
Yeah.
drove. It was what was it? The only place that was open at the time was this little dive, and I mean it was like a trucker's bar, and I was so naive, but we ended up talking about Bob Marley
He
and
loved Bob Marley.
oh my gosh, yeah. And anyways, and Pope Benedict, and I'm like, wow, such a humane guy. And this I think Hanby said that about him. That was like, you know, something just so humane about D.L. Schindler that, you know, convinced Hanby that actually this is why if this guy is Catholic, then I feel like I have a space here. A
Well, let's
place here.
put some
So
flesh on those bones just a little bit, because I think this is absolutely key and critical. It's at the very heart of the Communio project as such, which is why he's such a great entry into it, which is that
yeah,
first you begin with a profound and deep theological understanding of the tradition, and you hold that understanding with deep conviction, and you read voluminously on that tradition, and you know it inside and out, and you have a great grasp of it, and that then gives you the fulcrum upon which then to move out to deal with a whole range of other thinkers, to in a sense appropriate the spoils of Egypt
yeah,
for that vision. There is no cancel culture in David L. Schindler at all. He
yeah,
was this expansive, inquisitive mind that could see all kinds of implications in thinkers that he disagreed with most profoundly, and that then spilled over into, like you said, his ability to simply talk with someone like you or someone like me, that he didn't know, and what he would come on fire if you would say, tell me a little bit about Schelling and what. Oh, Schelling, yeah, blah, blah. And
yeah.
boom, off he would go, and there you go.
Yeah, yeah. I oftentimes I just loved kind of triggering him with different questions when I was studying there,
Yeah,
and I mean he was just so good to me and my wife. I mean, my wife is from Poland, and you know immediately she gravitated to him because she felt like he was like genuinely interested in where she came from. And I
yeah,
remember he took us to this great French restaurant as like a wedding gift, and I'll always remember that. It was just Schindler, I think, has shaped the way I see things more than anyone. Even, I mean, like my parents, but you know,
yeah.
obviously, but Schindler is really behind. I always go back to him. So
Yeah, I would say he's second in my brain in terms of people of second only to say Hans Urs von Balthasar.
mm,
And of course, he knew Balthasar, and his thought was very much in line with Balthasar's thought. Um, but yeah, he's simply a great entryway into communio theology, which is, of course, for the listeners who are always questioning, what is communio theology? It's rooted in the idea of an ecclesiology of communion, which is that we are sons and daughters of God through Christ, and thereby participants in the communio of the triune life of God. So there is a
Mhm.
powerful vertical sort of grounding theologically and metaphysically in the Trinitarian God, in the theology that then flows out of that. And then you take that fundamental insight and you bring it to the tradition, Aquinas, the fathers, the scriptures, even modern Baroque era and after thinkers. But that's sort of, it's very Trinitarian, very Christological, and as such, and I think you said it there at the beginning, it's just a very theological theology. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, his last talks at the Institute were on the primacy of God, right? And so you, as I think D.C. Schindler said in his eulogy for his father, like God, for him, God had to do with everything, even the way that even the way that you drive. Um,
Yeah.
so that's what I appreciated for him about him. Everything was had something to do with God and the way in which God has revealed himself in and through Christ. And so yeah, it was very Christocentric. So yeah, there's just so much there.
Yeah. But you mentioned going to like a lousy restaurant or something, a diner or whatever. But I had a
Yeah.
similar experience. I mean, I suppose this whole episode is, excuse me, excuse me, I could edit that out, I guess, but I won't. My allergies are kicking in. But anyway, Schindler had given a talk at DeSales University, and Hauser and I were driving him somewhere, I don't know, and taking him to the airport, right? And he was hungry for breakfast, so we went to this absolute dive diner. And the thing is, he didn't blink twice about it. I mean, he was a guy who loved fine dining. Oh yeah,
Mhm.
you could take him to some of the finest restaurants, and he'd find something to complain about there. But he wouldn't complain at all if you went to a dive restaurant. He would just slurp up his, cheese omelet and home fries and be on with it.
Yeah.
But that was David. That was, and what made him a great character was he could be irascible. I mean, he could be a bit cantankerous when he wanted to be as well. He could get his dander up, and you would see it sometimes, and it would come out.
Yeah.
And the infamous,
Yeah.
when where he'd be at a conference and somebody would be up at the lectern saying something that you said, there wasn't a metaphysic out there that he basically agreed with, that he thought was sufficient, and somebody would be up there going on, and Schindler would be beet red face, furiously writing on his notepad with his right leg bouncing up and down, up and down, up and down, just full of this energy and this passion, waiting his turn to give his rejoinder to what was going on, but never
Yeah.
harsh, always constructive, always just, But anyway, so how in that sense has his theology then sort of informed your theological career?
Well, I mean, I I don't know. I mean, I try to bring it to the classroom with high schoolers, and there was such depth there that a lot of the students, I mean, that you said you could bring anybody into the conversation, and so
Yeah.
I would try to kind of give them a little bit of his insight on the culture to them, and since they responded really well to that, and I mean, their response wasn't lukewarm. It was either very enthusiastic, or sometimes people were extremely against what they were hearing. But I knew that he was
Yeah.
onto something then. But even in like how I think about education, I mean, the institute, the Word on Fire Institute, we just had like an education seminar, and this was maybe a little too much, but I gave him one of David L. Schindler's articles on intelligence in the academy.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I didn't know the participants that well until we finished, but there were some people even teaching like mathematics at Notre Dame, and some people at other at the teaching in universities, who said, like, for the first time they were able to take their discipline and then relate to see this integrative approach to
Yeah.
theology. And so, like you said, how God, the primacy of God, it has to do with everything. So oftentimes people, when they see, oh, education fellow, they think I'm like I have like all these education degrees, and then they figure out I don't. But I think that Schindler's approach, has something really, really insightful to say about exactly what's needed in Catholic education at the college level and at the high school level, because most people just don't have that integrative way of thinking, and they tend to kind of bring that extrinsicism into how they perceive God. So we have just a bunch of, as Christian Smith says,
Yeah.
like, you know, what is it? Moral therapeutic deists
Yeah.
teaching in our schools. And so I don't know, my mission since day one is kind of to be to, I don't know, initiate people into the Schindler way and Communio way of thinking, and how they
Yeah.
think about education. So
Yeah, that's a great story because I think it's been repeated over and over in many different venues because it's so revelatory to so many academics in our culture who have never been
mhm,
exposed to this before when they finally are, because what our culture does is privatize religion
yeah,
and sequester it into the realm of the subjective, right up there with my preference for a cheeseburger rather than a fish sandwich, you know,
yeah,
and we don't argue about things like that. Culture is secular. Culture and the academic world is secular, and if you want to add some Jesus sprinkles on top of the secular ice cream, that's on you. But they remain.
yeah,
That's a line from Bill Portier, his famous Jesus sprinkles analogy. That's our whole culture, and that was Schindler's great critique, is use the word extrinsic. He was opposed to that kind of making God into this utterly extrinsic reality, having no purchase on the really real. And this is
yeah,
my shtick all the time, where I talk about the nullification of God. John Paul called it and Benedict called it the eclipse of God. And this was Schindler's thing as well. And so he understood quite well that theological ideas can integrate if we have the mediating language of metaphysics well developed as well. So you develop your metaphysics out of your theological moorings, and then that
yes,
metaphysics acts as that integrating factor that then draws all other disciplines up into it. It's very deeply related to the theology of nature and grace that Schindler held, which was very Lubacian, which was
yeah,
that essentially grace is not something glommed onto my already independent nature. Grace is the intrinsic fulfillment of what it means to be a human being. Therefore, I don't become less human the closer I get to God. I become more human the closer I get to God. I become more
yeah,
myself. Nature becomes properly, and this is Mike Hanby's big thing, nature becomes properly nature only insofar as it is united and integrated into God. You
mhm,
remove nature from God, and nature loses its natureness. Humanity loses its humanity, and so on. And this is why Schindler's vision has this powerful integrating feature within it, because what it does is, as I said in my last interview, is that it out immanentizes the immanentizers. All right, it
yeah,
out worldlies the worldly types.
yeah.
I'm using all these neologisms, but anyway, maybe you can comment on that.
No, no, and like even you going kind of in that Londelian, taking like
Yeah,
what maybe modern philosophy rightly sees, and as Robert Spemann says, like out, it's giving it a better foundation for,
yeah,
still upholding that insight. And this is like, when you read Schindler, appreciating people like Nietzsche, and who upheld, right, this kind of like earthly, what does he say? There's this exact line I'm trying to recall what he says about kind of being focused in on the earth and the here and now. Um, but if you don't connect it to that which is beyond, and your notion of transcendence matters too, but then you'll lose the kind of particularity and concreteness of all creaturely things.
yeah,
And
because
this is,
good.
yeah, his son's reading of Plato has a lot to do with this as well. I mean, I don't know how many times you hear Plato presented as a dualist, but with the allegory of the cave, but the fact that he goes back down, and then connecting all things to the transcendent forms actually brings out the kind of particularity, of all things, without kind of separating the two. It's all has to be
Yes,
together for,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's opposed to all those radical dualisms that we are so locked into this notion of God's impassibility and God's timelessness and God's eternity existing in this realm, which is, as Bishop Barron likes to say, is in competition with the natural world. Once again, it's part of that extrinsicism. And yet what we need to understand, and we see this especially with a focus on the incarnation, which is why Schindler loved Peggy and these guys. What
Mhm.
you understand is that time and finitude are constitutive features of creation, constitutive features of human nature. Our carnality, our bodiliness are constitutive features of what it means to be a human being. They're perfections and not imperfections. And therefore, there is something analogous within God to all of these things. Balthasar spoke of God's eternity not as atemporal, but as supratemporal. And that's how it time and finitude can be incorporated into the divine precisely as time and finitude, because there's something analogous within God to event, to time, to relation. And those, it's a change, it's a changeless changing, if you can put it that way. It's paradoxical. um, uh, and that's the power of the integrating vision. But as soon as you fall back into these hard dualisms, finitude equals imperfection, then time equals a falling away from eternity, and all of these things are but dross to be burned off. So it's I think it's one of the sources of atheism, and we can get into Nietzsche's atheism a bit,
Yeah.
because when your approach to the world is simply a series of noughts, not this, not that, not this, not that, not that, and it's all negated, what you end up with is a fantastical image of God as this amorphous gas that is less real than our reality. And so it's hard for us to imagine it. It's hard for us to enter into it because it seems so contrary to what we are as finite, time bound, carnal beings. If there's no point of reference for any of those things in God, and I don't mean God has a body or time bound like we are, you get the point. But anyway, that's my riff on what you just said. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's all great stuff. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. But like reading American culture and kind of bringing those things into this. I mean, I remember I found a copy. Somebody was throwing it out in the dumpster at the Institute, but there's this copy of Schindler's dialogues with like Novak, Weigel, and
Yeah,
Newhouse. And I remember he always liked to talk about was it uh, Herberg, the Jewish
yeah,
sociologist.
yeah,
Um, but Herberg had this like um, they asked people in America, and this is like in the 50s, at the height when like people were
yeah,
going to mass, like what are the most important historical events to have occurred? And these are people who like if you ask them like if the faith is really important to them would obviously say yes, very much so. um, and yet when asked about a kind of historical religion, which incarnation, all this stuff, that
yeah,
really had nothing to do with what they thought was kind of important in history. I think it was Christopher Columbus, discovering the New
yeah,
World was number one, but everything had to do with uh, tech, uh, technological inventions. And so I think like Schindler was like Nietzsche, and in this article which he mentions Herbert, he brings Nietzsche into this with the death of God from from the gay science and thus spake Zarathustra. But like it's kind of like the primacy of God, this awareness that God is more real than the creation itself. Um, and,
yeah, yeah,
and it for him, it's like this is kind of like the star has died, and yet it's in a matter of time the darkness will be upon us. It's still there, but it's an ossified faith. And so we were
yeah,
talking about bourgeois spirit and all of that stuff, and this is what I like Schindler and like Nietzsche. Paul Tillich says that he appreciates Nietzsche so much because he casts dynamite at the kind of bourgeois Christian spirit. Um, Now,
Yeah.
whether or not Paul Tillich is representative of Christianity, at least he likes Nietzsche
Well,
for challenging this.
Tillich was a believer, and Tillich
Yeah,
was a profound thinker. I mean, obviously, I ultimately disagree with some very important aspects of his thought, but I used his book Dynamic of Faith in one of my intro to theology courses.
yeah,
It went over like a lead balloon because the students didn't get it. I have great admiration for Tillich. Like I said, I disagree with large elements of what he says, but he's a very profound thinker in so many ways. I like his
yeah,
stuff about broken and unbroken myths and that sort of thing. But you know, you mentioned
yeah.
Herberg. If memory serves, I'm going way back to graduate school at Fordham now. But I think it was Herberg who coined the phrase "the American way of life,"
Yeah.
as you know, where he gave all these descriptors of what is essentially what you were talking about, bourgeois. The cult of bourgeois well-being, as Berdyaev calls it, as Del Noce calls it, the sort of cult of well-being, material well-being, and he gives all these descriptors of the typical American. So it's that question doesn't surprise me. You know, what are the great moments in history? And Herbert then categorized all of, well, this is just what we would call the American way of life. And
Hmm.
insofar, and this is now to bring it back to Schindler, Schindler's point would be is that the neocons, the guys you mentioned, Novak, Newhouse, Weigel, all good guys in their own way. I
Yeah,
love them
for
all in their
sure.
own way. George Weigel and I are little email buddies from time to time, and I like George.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah,
but I have disagreements with them as well, the neocons, and so did Schindler. And Schindler's point was, you guys are buying into the American way of life. You don't think you are, but you are, insofar as you are accepting the foundational metaphysical principles that guide the American way of life. You are buying into it. Now those guys disagreed, but I'm on Schindler's side on this one.
yeah, yeah. I have to go back to those exchanges, but I know, like, I've engaged with some of the neocons myself, and they say, well, that Schindlerian kind of metaphysical fog, right? And it
Yes.
is, but Schindler does bring up, like, metaphysics. It has to do with metaphysics and the priority of maybe act over being, and then and kind of properly having a robust conception of being itself. I mean, I think he's right. And, culturally speaking, America, I'm trying to always understand Weber, but the appreciation for Weber, who also was influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, the
Yeah.
seeing this kind of, you know, kind of the emphasis being upon, well, eventually what this particular form of Protestantism that influences this American way of life, and just how we think about being itself, is just so fascinating. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, sorry, I'm
Yeah.
grabbing all of these people,
Well,
and it's probably
yeah.
just a.
Well, I'm probably responsible for the fact David L. Schindler, once gave a talk at a communion liberation event at Columbia University in New York, and Rodney and I, Hauser and I, took a bunch of students there, and I had just had, if memory, I had just had an email exchange with George Weigel, and I mentioned him so that I was going to go and hear Schindler, and he admires Schindler, and they were friends, and they sort of liked each other, even as they disagreed. But and this would have been in the early 2000s, and John Paul was still around, and Weigel said in his email to me, "Oh, it gets so frustrating, all these Schindlerian metaphysical talks and so on." He goes, "Schindler is down there in Washington, ensconced in his little metaphysical fog, while the rest of us are out here, doing the hard work of changing culture and so on." And I mentioned that to Schindler right before his talk. He said, What did George say?" And I thought, oh shit, I shouldn't have said that, right? And immediately Schindler went over in a corner. He was scratching some stuff on a notepad, and his leg was moving 9 miles an hour. And then he gave up, and he didn't mention Weigel at all in the talk, and he didn't incorporate any of that. But I think he was writing it down for future reference. And what struck me, and the story isn't just anecdotal. What struck me about that was Weigel's response was, in essence, saying, this is so American, right? So pragmatic, was that what Schindler was doing was inconsequential because it's up here in the world of forms, in the world
Yeah,
of metaphysics. which really doesn't count, apparently, which doesn't count as helping to change the culture, change the world, move the needle. That doesn't count. What counts
Yeah.
is on the ground, foot to ground sort of hard politics, and that's where the rubber meets the road, where we really then
Yeah.
engage in the realpolitik of dealing with the two-party system and the politics that have been dealt to us. And let's move within that realm and stop these fantasies about metaphysics and whatnot. And I think therein encapsulates the very problem that the
Yeah.
neocons have, which is why their movement is now fizzled.
Hmm.
Okay. Because the entire Reagan revolution is dead. That form of American conservatism is dead. And with it, the sort of Catholic moment, that's Newhouse, neocon sort of America as a crypto Catholic country, is dead. It's
Yeah.
deader than dead.
Well, Schindler, and I think DC brings this address up in his eulogy. But Dr. Schindler, D.L. Schindler, give us this address Pope Benedict gave to, I think it was like the representatives of the French of culture in right outside of Paris. I think it was like in 2010 or something.
Okay.
But it's about the search for God, and how culture, it comes out like foremost from this just utter search for the infinite, for God, this passion for God.
Yeah.
And then all of these the culture ends up changing because of that, not because you want to get involved in, the culture wars or all changing things. But kind of from from prayer itself, the importance of prayer. I remember because I was a student when Pope Benedict um, resigned as Pope, and Pope and D.L. Schindler went to visit him, and D.L. came back with these great stories of how Pope Benedict is living the life of a monk, just praying for the church. And at the time, close friends were talking about how disappointed they were in Pope Benedict and all that. And there's something to that maybe, but Schindler's like positive reaction of just the praying for the church is the most important thing we do, always moved me. And so many of us today have a hard time seeing the significance of contemplative orders. I mean, one of my uncles is a doctor, and he sometimes cares for contemplative nuns. And he one time asked me, like, why do these orders exist? Shouldn't they be doing something in the world? Like, they're just praying all day.
Just
And
praying.
yes, yeah, that's how it was worded. And I think perhaps wanting to go study with Schindler was a way of answering my uncle's question. So
Yeah. Well, our entire life, I mean, we are a priestly people, and the essence of a priest is intercession.
yeah,
And in many ways, our vocation as Christians is intercessory, to intercede on behalf of ourselves and others, and with an emphasis on others, especially those in most need of thy mercy, Lord.
mhm,
And this is what God expects of us. This is what God wants of us, to pray constantly, to intercede for others. Now, it seems so ephemeral to us because we don't see immediate consequences. We don't see immediate results. Um, but we need more theologians to think in terms of quantum thinking, in a sense, because it's amazing to me the extent to which a kind of atomistic, Newtonian, materialistic view of existence still pertains, even for Christians who, when we think of prayer, we think of it as just sort of evaporating into the air, like so much spit in the wind, that has no long-term consequences, like one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. But what we know from quantum thinking, right, is entanglement, the theory of entanglement, which is that if two electrons are entangled at any point, if you disentangle them and send them off in opposite directions, you can influence this one over here, and it will actually then change the behavior of that one over there. They can be light years away and still entangled. Now, what that means in terms of our fundamental understanding of just the laws of physics is that everything is connected on a profound, deep level. That's why so many of physicists who truly understand are into like the Tao of physics and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. They're the most
Yeah.
mystical of all the scientists. And yet we don't translate that into our notion of prayer. That what I'm doing in my room, what Pope Benedict is doing in the quiet of his room is entangled. It's
Yes.
entangled with people. That's why Saint Teresa of Lisieux is the patron saint of missionaries, for crying out loud, even though she was in
Yeah.
a cloister, never was out in the missions herself at all.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, you got me going on that one, because I think that is
But
just so neglected, and Schindler was all about that contemplative dimension.
yeah, and you bringing up the little flower, I was reading some of Ferdinand Ulrich the other day, and I was just trying to find like any section where he deals with Nietzsche, and I think it's in Homo Abyssus. Yeah, it's in Homo Abyssus where he talks about Nietzsche, and then he responds to Nietzsche with little flower as kind of like, this is
Yeah.
where the true power is, um, and you know, I was going to who Schindler's interest in quantum physics is
Oh,
so profound.
David
Um,
Bohm.
yeah, I've got a couple of his books over here. But yeah, it's so interesting that like we are
Yeah,
still in the Newtonian world,
we are.
and our way
We
of
are.
thinking. So, um, you
It's
know,
hard.
Larry,
It's hard not to be, because the Newtonian physics still works on a macro level, right? If I
yeah,
want to figure
yeah,
out, the laws of gravitation and motion to send a rocket to the moon, I can still use Newtonian principles with some
yeah,
qualifications from quantum thinking. But yeah, David Schindler was very interested in quantum physics. He was interested in the implicate and explicit order of the physicist David Bohm. And once again, it's because he had that powerful integrative vision of everything, and didn't shy away from entangling theology in a lot of different things.
yeah, yeah. No,
Well,
it's
we have about another half hour or so to go. If you have the time,
yeah,
let's move on a bit to Nietzsche, because we had a little conversation as I was setting up this interview. In fact, it's one of the things that prompted me to ask you to do this interview, where you mentioned to me that you were reading an intellectual biography of the philosophy of Nietzsche by Rudiger, and I
yeah.
immediately went and ordered the book, which has not yet come. The snow, the satanic snow yesterday
Oh yeah,
delayed
yeah.
delayed the UPS. By the way, I hate winter and I hate snow. They're inventions of Satan, tools of the Antichrist. And yesterday is Exhibit A as to why snow is of Satan. But anyway, that's
How
neither
much did you
here.
guys? How much did you get?
Oh, we didn't get that much, maybe 5 or 6
Oh,
inches, but it was a wet,
okay.
awful snow. And UPS decided that neither rain nor sleet nor hail, whatever, they couldn't deliver that day in their big truck. They didn't want to get it stuck or something. But anyway, I'm still awaiting the book. But and
Okay.
before I turn it over to you, I'm going to be interviewing after Christmas Jay Martin, who's a theologian at Notre
Yeah, I
Dame.
saw his piece on the death of God, and
Yeah. Oh, so you read that in Church Life Journal.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm glad that
I
you
have to
read that.
reread it because his. I really like what Jay was doing with the piece, but I don't think I properly got everything. But
Well, I don't
there's
think I did either, which is why I'm going to interview. I interviewed his wife. Rodney and I did a
yeah. Oh,
couple
that was
of
excellent interview.
Jennifer Newsom Martin, who is a delight and a genius and should be known far and wide. That's a shout
Yeah.
out to you, Jennifer. But in this article by Jay, what really struck me is two things leapt out at me. Number one, he wanted to emphasize for Nietzsche atheism. What Nietzsche did for atheism was to put pathos into it, to put verve and bite and emotion into it. The entire affective sphere of our nature he put into
Mhm.
atheism. To that extent, and this is the second thing that struck me, Jay Martin said that for Nietzsche, atheism was not the conclusion to a set of premises. It wasn't the conclusion of an argument, but atheism is a premise. Atheism is a first premise out of which a series of conclusions then follow, conclusions that we have not appreciated and grasped. So in other words, what Jay Martin is saying is that the Nietzschean project of atheism kills the Enlightenment project atheism as just so much disembodied, dispassionate sort of argumentation
Mhm.
And Nietzsche really slays that dragon, because Enlightenment thinkers want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have, in a sense, atheism, but they don't want any of the logical entailments of that atheism as they build human rights and conscience and all this
Yeah.
grandiose visions of the a sort of Star Trek vision of an ethical humanity into the future, using our technology wisely and so on. Whereas Nietzsche explodes all that and says, you people are living in a fool's paradise if you think the death
Yeah.
of God is this irenic thing that's going to unleash liberation. In many ways, not. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's in a sense what I got from Jay Martin's article. But what did you get from reading the intellectual biography? And you can comment on that or on Jay Martin's article.
Yeah, I mean, I started reading this because I saw an endorsement by Thomas Nagel as being one of the best portraits of Nietzsche. And
Wow.
very often you have like various types of Nietzsche that people have a something that they're trying to find Nietzsche supporting. But the thing that always attracted me to Nietzsche, and this book does a great job of really
Hold the book up
emphasizing.
again and
Oh yeah,
say it, and give the
yeah,
titles up for those who are just listening.
yeah. It's Nietzsche, a philosophical biography. Um, and
By
Safransky is
by
a
by
Rudiger Safransky. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. Um, but he's great. It turns out I have his book on. He has other philosophical biographies. One on Heidegger, another on Schopenhauer, and on Goethe. So,
wow.
anyways, yeah, he and you get a sense of how rich the German, 19th late 19th late 18th century thinking is informing Nietzsche, but he hates it so much at the same time. Um, this book does a great job of getting into like every single work of Nietzsche's, and showing you all the different influences going on in his thinking. Because a lot of times I have a hard time with Nietzsche because he writes in such a fashion of
Yeah.
trying to see exactly what is he referring to
Yeah.
here. But Fransky really provides all of that, and he gets into the musical soul of Nietzsche. Like he says, I
Wow.
think in the beginning that Nietzsche
I've never
always
heard that
aspired.
before. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so music for him, I mean, he says that Nietzsche primarily wanted to be a musician, but he just didn't. One of his great frustrations is that he never like kind of realized that. So he was going to bring that into the way his whole style, the way he was going to do philosophy with this
It,
kind
it
of very Dionysian, you know,
it's lyrical, it's poetic, it's powerful.
yes, yes. And so, he makes a lot of the birth of tragedy. I always thought that Nietzsche was kind of embarrassed by that work because that was his first big work that, most of his philologists never at the time never really um, praised the book. In fact, that was kind of like the beginning of the end for him in his classical philology career. But
Yeah.
Nietzsche just had a sad life. And what Safransky shows here is that um, Nietzsche is somebody who, when he writes, he's writing from experience. He doesn't kind of have this like, detached view of the world.
Right.
But he the thing I like about him is he really shows you all of his hatreds. Like if he doesn't like something, he really doesn't like it, and he's gonna keep as much scorn on it as possible. If he doesn't like Wagner, if Wagner is kissing the butt of the Kaiser way too much, he is going to totally reject Wagner. Um, and so
Okay.
I'm kind of this way myself. Um, and I really like when people have a problem with Nietzsche, I just think they just don't get him. And
Yeah.
so I really encourage everybody to to read this book because
Well, yeah, and I think too that a lot of people, just average armchair academics who have never read Nietzsche and Nietzsche and don't understand him too well, is that there's a reactive element there in the sense that every half-witted, half-educated adolescent boy, especially you come across, say, in high school, who's decided that they don't believe in God, is suddenly now a will to power Nietzschean. Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm all into Nietzsche and will to power and so on. And Nietzsche would have despised
yeah,
what those little vermin stood
yeah.
for, as but anyway, and so there
Like
is,
in
in other words, there's sort of an Ayn Rand quality to it. It's like
yeah,
every atheist high school boy goes through an Ayn Rand phase or a Nietzschean phase, and so of
yeah.
course, Ayn Rand was a fool, but Nietzsche wasn't. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, but it was great to read, like, Hans von Balthasar, Shavara, all of these kind of greats, early 20th century greats. They all engaged Nietzsche. In fact, I hope
Yeah,
I'm saying his name correctly, but
De
like I
Lubac
found,
certainly did. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I found this section in Hans von Balthasar's book on Romano Guardini, on which they're engaging Hölderlin, but Nietzsche saw himself as and Safransky says this, as an apostle for Hölderlin.
yeah,
And this kind of Heraclitean, he liked the kind of the Heraclitean um,
yeah,
way about him, but also he kind of shares a similar fate in how he goes into madness at the end. So for a lot of people, like Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Hölderlin kind of have this tragic romantic quality to them, and kind of sensing the twilight, the night of the gods. Um,
yeah.
so
So how does Nietzsche change philosophy? I mean, there's obviously going to be a pre-Nietzsche and a post-Nietzsche, as there's pre-Kantian and post-Kantian. What flows from Nietzsche? Who's downstream of Nietzsche?
well, I don't. How does he? Well, actually, in the last part of this book, in the epilogue, Fransky gets into Europe discovers Nietzsche.
Yeah,
And so are you asking about, like, the people who flow out of him?
yeah,
So he gets into like the typical, you know, Thomas Mann was I mean, this is not
yeah.
philosophy, but really, really
Interesting.
appreciated him.
Yeah,
He Bergson, with kind of this, like,
yeah,
the vitalism is is really much influenced. Shaler is responding to Nietzsche, but at the same time really appreciates him. And in a way, I'm trying to figure out whether or not how much as a philosopher you can imagine John Paul II read Nietzsche, but I'm trying to see, insofar as he read Shaler, how much of Nietzsche influenced John Paul II. In fact, the "become what you are" that John Paul II often said,
yeah,
Safransky quotes that a lot. That's Nietzsche's line. Um, but this
yeah.
kind of heroic, it's not coming out of a lack, but out of a fullness that John Paul II is trying to kind of see in this kind of Christian heroism, as a response to this kind of decadent,
Yeah, because
liberalism.
what Nietzsche's trying to recover in a lot of ways is the heroic element
Yeah,
of human existence, which is why he heaped coals of indignation upon bourgeois existence,
yeah,
the sort of the existence that lives simply for penultimate, mediocre, day-to-day quotidian things of life, and that this had robbed human, and he blamed Christianity for it, right? Because he saw
yeah,
Christianity as the kind of domestication of everything and the ultimate expression of the bourgeois spirit, and which, of course, then what we see in De Lubac and others, and Guardini and Balthasar and Ratzinger and JP2 is an awareness. No, Christian heroism is the essence of the gospel. It's what we're called to, and so Nietzsche ain't got nothing on us in terms of
yeah,
calling for the heroic. In fact, our heroism is a far more profound version of heroism
yeah,
than what Nietzsche proposes, because what Nietzsche ultimately proposes crashes and burns on its own internal contradictions. Let's just put it
yeah,
that way.
yeah. But the thing I like about him, though, is he does, like, kind of allow for saying that the kind of this rationalism of the West, kind of explodes that, and not agreeing with him that everything is just interpretation. But at
Right.
least it allows for the kind of story of Christianity to just start from its own, kind of assert itself, and then reason from there, instead of trying to come to that as like a as an end of a conclusion. So
Which is interesting, because what the provocation that Nietzsche is to Christianity should engender in us is a desire, if you will, it's ressourcement. It's a desire to go back to the sources, and ultimately to the source, Christ himself,
yeah.
and to reimagine anew, not reinventing the wheel, not contradicting the tradition. Please don't email me with your nonsense. But to, well, because you get this, you get from the trads. Just, the
Yeah.
trads are an annoying lot of people, because they're wooden and flat-footed and have no sense of anything beyond a syllabus of errors. Anyway, there, I said it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So for those who want to email me, Nietzsche was wrong. Okay, he's a heretic or whatever. Okay, but what Nietzsche calls us to is, in a sense, a desire to reimagine the Christ event once again for our
Mhm.
time, and to do so in radically new ways, radically innovative, creative ways that remain faithful to the tradition, but deepening that tradition, in some ways bursting the wineskins of that tradition to discover the better wineskins of that tradition.
Yeah.
Because we have to make, as I didn't coin this phrase, somebody else did, and I can't remember. We have to make Christianity wild again. We have to make
Yeah.
Christianity weird again. We have to make it different again. We have to make it into a provocation. And you cannot do that with bourgeois status quo beige Catholicism. You can't. And that Catholicism is dying, if not dead, in the West.
Mhm.
The gurgles of its death throes are everywhere. That kind of mediocre bourgeois Christianity is deader than dead. And so the only good thing that's going to come from that is this awareness that something new has to arise from those ashes, something Christologically new. Let's put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. In terms of rediscovering Christ event, I mean, Nietzsche certainly forces you to go back and to say, is this kind of weak narrative of Christianity making the culture sick? Maybe he's onto something with a certain type, you know,
Yeah,
that came
yeah.
about. But
Well,
his
because
radicalness, yeah, no, his radicalness forces you
yes,
to kind of see anew. I
that's
mean,
it.
he's kind of like, yeah, it's like, okay, we're talking, okay, you want voluntarism, nominalism, whatever. You know, I hate when those terms are thrown around, but he's going to be like, okay, I'm gonna like put those things on steroids, and then it's just going to explode all of that from within, and
Yeah,
then,
yeah,
like you said, you have this kind of new sun. The sun can then finally rise, and this rebirth. And so, this is what I like, and I have to dig into this, but Nietzsche, there has to be something about a connection between John Paul II and Nietzsche. And maybe somebody's already done this, but when John Paul II talks about this kind of new evangelization,
yes,
it's at the moment when the cross is gone up in Nova Huta, and Stanislav Grigol talks about this is like one of the first times he talks about the new evangelization. But there's this kind of nobility that is asserted right at that moment. John Paul II had this great love um, for the Polish noble tradition. And you see,
yes,
Nietzsche is actually interesting. There's 9 times in which he refers to himself as a Pole, and I don't think it's actually true that he was ethnically. He thought possibly that he was actually Polish, but he wanted to identify with this aristocratic Polish tradition that he loved because it was in some ways it was so assertive and so kind of foolhardy that they would fight even if like their demise was just imminent. They'll go to their own death. There was this heroic quality
yes,
that you see. Yes, John Paul II loved this, and when John
yeah,
Paul II read this kind of tradition he got from his father at a young age of this, like, in Sienkiewicz, about this kind of, Polish aristocratic spirit, this warrior kind of, thing that they thought came from this like this they called it Sarmatism, which is like this Persian warrior class, and they were also great lovers of Mary. So whenever they would go into battle, they would sing the kind of Theotokos song. But there was this let's say
Wow.
strong quality to their Christianity, not like in the sense of like this kind of uber macho, you
Yeah.
know, you know,
Well, you're stirring my Polish
I
blood here. I mean, as I
yeah,
think I told you, I'm half Polish. My father's Chapp is an anglicized Polish name. My father's Polish, not from Poland, but of
yeah,
Polish descent. And so
Chope, right?
Chop, yeah, Chop.
Yeah.
I don't even know what that means in Polish originally. But
I, I gotta ask my wife. I don't know if it
yeah,
has something to do with head.
could be. My
Sounds
family's
like the
originally from near Gdansk in that
oh,
region
okay.
of Poland, way up
Okay.
north, way up
Yeah.
north. And but anyway, so yeah, all that's too personal. I mean, in the sense that it's neither here nor there. But I just find that kind of thing so stirring. And I think you're right. I think one of the things that is often so misunderstood or not appreciated enough, not misunderstood, just not appreciated enough because it's not emphasized enough, just how Polish John Paul II was and how moved he was by this whole romantic Polish mystical lyrical element within him. Some
Yeah.
of my friends say, I much prefer Ratzinger's encyclicals to John Paul's because Ratzinger's are so much clearer, and John Paul circles a topic, circles and circles and circles before he lands it. I love that stuff. I mean, I love Ratzinger's encyclicals too,
Mm.
but I love the lyrical quality so much of what John Paul writes. He remains the great hero of my life, great ecclesiastical hero of my life, and so on. But anyway, back to Nietzsche. I remember about 20 years ago now, maybe even longer ago, David Bentley Hart had an article in First Things, an essay called Christ and Nothing.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a sense, he's making the same argument that one of the benefits of a sort of nihilistic philosophical atheism with a certain pathos to it, as Nietzsche presents us, is that it scrapes away illusions. It scrapes away the halfway house of the Enlightenment. It scrapes away the bourgeois niceties that we cover over our nihilism with, and that what we are left with is a stark choice: Christ or
Yeah.
nothing. And that's
Yeah.
when I say we need to present Christ anew in a new evangelization. Obviously, once again, I don't mean a different Christ than the one we've known all along. What I mean,
Yeah.
though, is that it has to be then not through the lens of our parishes and synods and which parishes should we close and how do we reform the seminaries and what are we going to do for this year's capital campaign, and all those things are nice and all, but they're
Yeah.
just tap dancing on the Titanic. For
Yeah.
crying out loud, we need to
That's
understand
when you
this.
need Nietzsche to show up.
Exactly. At a
Yeah.
diocesan synod. Notice how all these dioceses hold these synods and they all have these great little names like moving again in the spirit and stuff like that,
Yeah.
And ultimately, all they are a group of people coming together to figure out what parishes are we going to close. Uh, because we don't have enough priests and these old ethnic parishes are decaying and falling apart and don't have parishioners. So we need to figure out how to consolidate. And these are all just sort of rearguard actions as the Baroque Catholicism that we all inherited in the West is just crumbling all around us. Perhaps I'm too cynical and dire, but I have been in conversation with a reader of my blog. Ken Mayas is his name. So Ken, if you're out there, big shout out to you. But he's been talking with me a lot about this, about, these parishes are dying. I mean, the whole parish system is dying. When you have one priest in
Yeah.
charge of three parishes or three churches part of one parish, then you begin to realize, ooh, that old parish model is kind of on its way out. Something new is emerging out of the old. But anyway, I digress once again. You get my juices flowing here, Robert. This is great. I wanted then, before we have maybe about 5-10 minutes left, and not because we can't go on and on and on, but because I don't like these things to go on way too long because
Yeah.
it taxes the patience of listeners. But you are the word on fire fellow for education. We've kind of talked about this before, and so everything I've just said about parishes and bougie Catholicism pertains to this. I mean, what does all of this mean in terms of how we approach Catholic education? I mean, like a year or so ago, you emailed
Yeah.
me once, said we need to develop like a Balthasarian approach to education, or Catholic
Oh.
education or something, and I thought about that. I'm not even certain I know what that would be, but I mean, I'm putting you on the spot. Like, what's the practical solution here? What do we do now? I don't know, and I doubt
I
you
don't
know. But
know. Maybe like you
maybe
said
you've got
with the
some, at least some
parishes.
insights or ideas about Catholic
I don't know.
education today.
I am not the person to ask like these questions. I guess I should be. But um, but I kind of I don't know. I'm just a pessimist myself. I'm trying to get out of that, but I just, like you said, with the parishes, I'm going to get in big trouble for saying this because my wife teaches at a school, and then I've taught at a school. So if anybody's listening to this that I used to work with, this is not like directed at you or even the people that I've talked to through Word on Fire. But I just think that, like you said, a lot of these schools, they're just dying. There is no pathos. Most of the people teaching in the schools, even in the priests, there's just something, I don't know, like there's, it's like almost kind of like a dead school already in terms of like,
Yeah,
like they're so ordered to, you things that are important, like getting a job. But if it's just about skills, acquiring skills, and it has nothing to do with like, really seeking God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. I mean,
yeah.
what's the point? So I just think if so many schools, it might be a good thing in some ways. I know the schools provide, I've heard a lot of arguments like, oh, okay, well, schools provide communities for, unlike public schools, and that's all good. But if it isn't like a radical community, um,
It's not.
I just, what's that?
It's not. It's not a radical community. I taught for
Yeah,
20 years at DeSales University, and I taught probably about three-fourths of my students at that Catholic institution were graduates of Catholic schools. And
yeah,
so I saw firsthand what the product that the Catholic schools was, that the Catholic schools were producing.
yeah,
And they were producing little techno pagans. Uh,
yeah.
and they were good kids. I loved them. I loved teaching
Oh,
them.
yeah,
They were open to conversation. I'm not disparaging the kids at all. I'm simply describing their worldview, and their
yeah,
worldview is techno paganry. I mean, it was. I mean, and I thought, what in the heck are the schools doing? Well, in some
yeah,
ways, they're doing what schools should be doing. It's just that they don't get the crisis that is at hand.
yeah,
And more importantly, the parents that send their kids to those schools don't often get
yeah.
the crisis that is at hand. And of course, then the schools are in a bind. How do we get more radical without losing three-fourths of our student population? That's the bind. That's the trouble. But
Well,
glass half full, glass half empty. I'm neither. I'm the kind of guy that says, you have a glass. Oh, you have a glass. There's a glass and it's got something in it. I don't see it. So that's how pessimistic I am, right?
well,
And
I
go ahead.
remember there was one school that was trying to kind of reassert its Catholic identity after years of just really watering it down. But it used this language of like our Catholic values. And
Yeah,
I'm like, Nietzsche says the minute you say something's a value, the minute you just
yeah,
discredit it, you don't really believe it.
that's right.
And so I've just kind of, I don't know, I'm really pessimistic when I see things like Saint Jerome's. I know there's some issues with like, you know, have getting teachers who actually have proper pedagogy and skills in that. But when I see like what Michael Hamby proposes for education and what they're doing
Yeah,
at the St. Jerome Institute in DC, that inspires something in me. But
yeah. I
sometimes you
don't know
see
if
these
Hanby
classical
is. I don't
schools.
know if Hanby is involved in that anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I still refer people to that
Yeah.
document he wrote because
Oh
I
yeah.
think that the questions he poses, like, is it just asking, is it beautiful? No
Yeah.
one's really asking those questions. They think it's just a bunch of silliness, but it's actually getting at the heart of what you're doing as a school. So,
Well, the thing is, I think too, it's related to a general dumbing down.
Yeah.
into mediocrity of just education in general. And so what we're really proposing here, Robert, is excellence,
Yeah.
excellence across. So, you're teaching young people to shoot for a high bar in everything they're doing, whether it's math or science or ballet or music or theology class,
Yes.
philosophy class, shop class. You are setting a high bar to be excellent in everything, and then to integrate all of those things together so that you are achieving something. So you are
Yes.
improving yourself in these profound spiritual ways. Right. But now it's dumbing down, dumbing down, dumbing down, dumbing down. And that then includes religion class and so on. So it all just wallows in this sort of general mediocrity that goes nowhere. And so
Yeah.
there's no pride in excellence anymore
Yeah.
in this
And
regard. And go ahead.
if a student is truly like a lover, that was like always
Yes,
something I was looking
perfect.
for in the students was I don't I mean, I had a hard time grading them oftentimes because sometimes the students who had the most like passion for a subject sometimes did poorly, but on the test. And I did not like the students who were so studious, but always just, well, is that going to be on the test? Always
Yeah,
asking me
well,
those
yeah,
types of
yeah,
questions because the student that they walk away and they just are so fascinated by reality and
yeah.
they're on the way. And I think that like excellence is that thing that they're seeking. And
Exactly.
if the schools are doing that, then that's great. But I just don't
Yeah,
find much of that. That's why I like Matthew Crawford so much. His
yeah,
book Shop Class is Soulcraft. Like the people who are in the shop class, they're they love cars or they love whatever
yeah.
they're working on. They're not doing it oftentimes just for a paycheck. But if you ask them about the trade, they oftentimes have that pathos. And so, anyways, I think that
Yeah. Go ahead.
no, I just want to bring students, I want teachers to see how all of that kind of finds its completion in something kind of like if you want to say like the summit of like the liturgy. How if the schools can kind of start thinking this way, and this is why I love using Schindler's essays, because he forces you to see how that excellence that you're seeking finds its fullness in what we call God. I mean, and
Yes, yes.
so this is something that I think we're trying to do at the Word on Fire Institute is just to get people to see that and then they can figure out the practical ways in which they'll bring that to their community. But if the community isn't really the community has to buy into that, otherwise the school will never flourish. So
Absolutely. We I could go on and on. Some of my favorite students at DeSales, academically speaking, were as dumb as two by fours. But I mean, just so obtuse, academically speaking, but had that passion for excellence, passion
yeah,
for greatness, passion for something more and bigger. And I loved those kids, absolutely loved them. One of the greatest, I think, harms that has been done to high school education in particular is like AP classes, advanced placement classes, so the whole notion of college prep in a high school, because that then gears everything towards a sort of standardized test, sort of placement in Ivy League school is so even if I'm reading great literature, whether it's Beowulf or Shakespeare or something like that, it's always with an eye towards, okay, is this going to help me max out my SAT scores and things like that.
yeah, yeah,
And the other thing is that we we undersell what young people are capable of. Young people are capable of great things. And one of the great, I think, problems with our current techno culture of video games and iPhones and things like this, and heck, I'm a hypocrite, I have an iPhone and so on. That's not the point. The point is that all of those things rob you of your motivation to pursue something excellent. And children are capable of great excellence in many, many, many things. And if you start them young with a high bar, without, and I'm not telling them, beating them into submission. You must be excellent, achieve, achieve. I don't like those kinds of parents either, but you get my point.
Yeah.
Place beautiful, excellent goals and things in front of your children. Take away their stupid computers and their iPhones and their video games. Take them away. All right. And put a violin in their hands. Right.
Yeah.
Put a chemistry set in their room. I mean, something that inspires their mind and their imagination.
But like going to like Woody Allen and Annie Hall, that scene in the beginning when he's at the doctor's office and his mom's like,
Yeah.
he isn't studying. But to bring in Schindler here, because
he was
Schindler
all depressed because the universe was expanding.
Expanding, yeah. I mean, and like, well, what does that have to do with Brooklyn? Brooklyn is not expanding. But like, but the thing is like what the kid sees is if all things is going to, if he has this kind of nihilism that in some ways he's on to something. But Schindler comes in and says the love is the kind of ultimate, the ordering principle of all reality, then that will inspire him. But if it's so the cosmos has to do with everything in your studies, and that's what exactly I want teachers to see. And so that will then motivate the students, because so many students they're saying that I mean, and I don't want to get, I'm not a psychiatrist or I don't know all this stuff, but I think part of the sadness that teachers are seeing in their students is because no one's showing them that. There is kind of this nihilism, even in the way we approach the world when we're studying it. So, Woody Allen is great on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, problem is nemo dat quod non habet. You can't give what you don't have. And the fact is, you can't inspire children if you're not inspired yourself. But where do you find such people? There are fewer and fewer such people to find. That's the sad fact that we're sort of up against. I was going to say something else, and it's totally a skip about propelling our kids towards excellence and not short circuiting that desire for excellence. I know what it was. It's that what we're describing is in some sense what some people are calling classical Christian education. And also, obviously, I'm a big fan of people that want to take the insights that we just talked about and develop them into a classical Christian education. The problem, though, that I have, it seems to me, just from a distance, I'm not heavily involved in the movement at all, though, is that a lot of that has gotten tied up with right-wing politics and sort of retrograde sort of cultural attitudes, I think. But anyway, that's just me. But I think there's a certain patina of a kind of conservative politics in a bad sense. I'm not a very political animal one way or the other. But
I don't have much involvement in that world, but from talking to some people who have been involved, I think that's right. But I mean, I was just talking to one of the guys who is an institute grad, and now he's he used to work in one of the classical schools. And this has nothing to do with the right-wing politics, but what he sensed was that they were just kind of checking off the boxes of like, okay, you read your Aristotle, you read your Thomas Aquinas, and so, but the thing is that the students, what he thought was that they what was more important was this wonder that they weren't cultivating in the school, and so he ended up going to a different school which he thought wasn't necessarily reading all those classical books, but still approached reality in that certain way. And I think that like, part of that political agenda that is oftentimes in those schools is because of a narrowing. And
I think so too. But anyway, that I don't want to end on a negative note, but
well, I was going to end on a very negative note, but I'll leave that.
You go right ahead, because I'm going to give you the last point here, and then we have to wrap this up.
Well, I mean, you said there's so few people out there, and it just seems like so many of those few people are also like sometimes a little elderly and they're dying, like Schindler. And I remember Schindler saying one time that like the church in some sense must die. And, Pope Benedict talks about the creative minority, but I mean, we can't like sell ourselves, short of that excellence. And so perhaps maybe, you don't have some kind of grand solution for reviving things. It can't be a superficial um,
No,
renaissance,
no.
but perhaps maybe things are going in a very, very dark period. And I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
think they
So
I think
yeah,
they are. I mean,
yeah,
personnel is policy. Personnel is policy. Gute Leute
yeah,
muss man haben. Gute Leute, and good
yeah.
people. And most people are good in a sort of bourgeois sort of way, but not excellent. Where do we find
Mhm,
excellence? Where do we find the personnel to engender this revolution in Christian education that we want to do? So you're not just checking
mhm,
boxes, or you're not just pushing right-wing politics. So you're not just sort of engaged in something ideological, that you are actually creating wonder in your students. That's a rare
mhm.
gift.
Yeah.
That's a rare gift. And that's why I often say teachers are born, not made. You can learn certain pedagogical skills uh, in education classes and so forth, but ultimately the teacher's task is to instill wonder, and that is an ability you're born with. It's not something that you
Yeah.
can learn through education. You have to be born with that gift to, in a sense, be infectious in your enthusiasm for something that you have achieved excellence in. And those people are becoming fewer and fewer and fewer in our culture, sadly. But anyway, this has been a great free ranging conversation. These are the videos I love. These are the conversations I love. You start off with a basic idea and then you free range and get into all kinds of things. And that's why I love talking to you, Robert. And because
Likewise.
we always do that. You and someone else, I do this with Zach Crippen, Cale Zeldin. They run podcasts and so forth. They are often interlocutors of mine that I love for the same reason. But anyway, hey, thanks
Mhm.
for coming on, and good luck at Word on Fire and everything that you're doing. And thanks for listening, everybody. And until next time, talk to you later. Bye.